Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Monteveros,
And I'm Michael Trombley.
and today we're going to be talking about Stoicism and wealth. Do a quick discussion on some of the Stoic ideas about, sort of the one way to put it is the benefits and risks of being wealthy, and then perhaps also some questions about pursuing wealth.
Mm-hmm. That's
Yeah.
great. I've been looking forward to this. It's all the years of studying Stoicism has come down to this moment of how do I get rich? Um,
Yeah.
how do we put
Yeah,
it
how do I
together?
build that stoic mindset to to achieve, intergenerational wealth and such?
It's good, but it is a good topic, right? Because I think it is the thing that there's lots of disagreements about what the good is, and the Stoics would say this. Epictetus has that famous line about everybody pursues the good. It's just people disagree about what the good is. But I think the thing that cuts across culture as a conception of the good would be, if not something like pleasure, then probably money. Like it is probably the thing the most unanimously understood to be a good or desired and pursued. Not without risks. Like I'm not going to say that everybody but the Stoics don't see that there's risks to pursuing wealth. Um, like people recognize the risks, but it's something that almost everybody wants more of or wants to keep. And so understanding how that fits into a Stoic picture of the good and Stoic picture of a good life in particular. So it's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting question. I think it nicely brings out some of these Stoic views about indifference. On one hand, if you're thinking about how people think about Stoicism, some people do use it sort of as they take this shallow Stoic type approach and use it as a way to build a mindset that'll be conducive for them to achieve career success, financial success, what have you. So you do have that side of things, but you also have in Stoicism a lot of, I think, or at least some questioning of that project, questioning the value of wealth to begin with, and at least in reaction to that shallow stoicism, there's sometimes a reaction against wealth as such.
Yeah, which I think there should be. And there's also this like or at least the hesitation. And we'll get into that in the quotes in a
Yeah,
second.
yeah.
There's also just we talk about you talked about that idea of there's some people use a shallow stoicism to develop wealth, but there's also just this explicit connection sometimes. Like there's a book coming out
Mhm.
called The Stoic Capitalist. I saw that recently, which is I think is just as explicit as possible, right? Which is about stoicism as a method of helping you acquire capital. And Caleb, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Scott Galloway. I've watched some of his stuff. He has a recent book out. He's an NYU professor of marketing, and he has a book out, and it's got this Stoic coin on the front, and he has this formula for a good life, or I think a formula for success, something like that. And a big part of it is Stoicism, but it's not that robust Stoicism. It's kind of the pick something you think will be financially uh, financially successful, and then be stoic about it, which is to say, small s kind of stoicism, which is to say, pursue it without being discouraged, pursue it without uh, having your plans fluctuate, be open for setbacks, anticipate what could go wrong. This kind of conception. So there is like
Mhm.
this. Yeah, there is this explicit, I think, trying to pull stoicism towards the pursuit of more material success. And again, not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, everything is about the way it's applied. Everything is about the way it's done. And we'll get into that today.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting that some of those takes seem a lot more Aristotelian in a way. They're like they do take on board some of the Stoic teaching, ancient Greek teaching around virtue and character at their best, but also there's this essential bit that you should be a good life requires some amount of financial success. I think that's what I would assume as in Galloway's equation. I don't know if that's true or not, but I would assume something like that's in there.
Yeah, it's just you want to be successful across. That's the real Aristotelian distinction, is that you want to be successful in multiple domains, and domains that extend beyond your character. So you want to have a great character, but you also want to be rich. You also want to have a nice house. You also want to be well liked. You also want to be successful. And so it's this extension. I'm not saying Galloway's arguing you should do terrible things to make money and calling it Stoicism, but he's saying that a good life involves success outside of just who you are, which is that Stoic versus Aristotelian distinction.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's look at some lines from the Stoics then to get a sense of what they said about money. So here's a line from Epictetus, Handbook 24, or a few sentences, I should say. If I can make money while remaining honest, trustworthy, and dignified, show me how, and I will do it. But if you expect me to sacrifice my own values just so you can get your hands on things that aren't even good, well, you can see yourself how thoughtless and unfair you are being. And that's coming from the handbook. Epictetus, his sort of greatest hits, the sort of Stoic maxims, and I think there's a reason that made it in, and that is because it's almost a perfect summary of the Stoic position, which is money isn't indifferent. It's not good in and of itself. It's probably preferable indifferent. And then naturally, all things considered, it's generally better to have more resources at your disposal, be more capable financially. But it's not good in and of itself, and it's never something that should be sacrificed for uh, things that are actually good for one's character.
Yeah, I think that's well put, and it's to me such a nice quote, as you said, about this idea of indifference, because we have an episode on different indifference. But that's something, when you start studying Stoicism, it's like, what's the purpose of calling things indifference if some of them are actually preferable, right? Like if I'm going to always be encouraged to select health when I have a chance, or even always encouraged to select wealth when I have a chance, why do we call it indifferent? Why don't we just call it good but less good than character? Well, it's good, but it's less good than virtue. Why do the Stoics make this division that just sounds like awkward to talk about? And this is the perfect example, is because Epictetus is saying, you're expecting me to sacrifice my values for something that isn't even good. So it shows that you're never in this conflict. There's never a kind of calculus for the Stoics when you're asked between, your character or wealth, your character or popularity or fame. There's never you're never weighing the options, because there's a type difference, because you have good things and indifferent things, and that's the value, I think, of having that distinction. Epictetus really summarizes it well there. I would never compromise my character, which is something that's good, for something that's not good. And it doesn't matter if that's how many millions of dollars that is. It's a type difference there.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. And I think that lays up a section from Seneca's Moral Letters really nicely, where okay, so you have that type difference. Um, Epictetus says also, if you can make money while maintaining your character or even improving your character, it's a good thing to do,
Mm-hmm.
or at least it's you can do it. Maybe it may not even be a good thing, but you can do it. Um, and so Seneca says one should not seek to lay up riches first. One may attain to philosophy, however, even without money for the journey. It is indeed so. After you have come to possess all other things, shall you then wish to possess wisdom also? Is philosophy to be the last requisite in life, a sort of supplement? Nay, your plan should be this: be a philosopher now, whether you have anything or not. For if you have anything, how do you know that you have not too much already? But if you have nothing, seek understanding first before anything else. That passage from Seneca stands out to me because Epictetus, one reading of the section from the handbook that we just had is okay, wealth, I should pursue it so long as I don't sacrifice my character. As long as I'm not sacrificing my character, I'm good to go, which is strictly speaking correct. But I think Seneca brings back the framing. What's most important isn't just, having that sort of almost constraint on pursuing wealth. It, it's having that focus on philosophy. And Musonius Rufus has this nice description of philosophy as nothing more than the practice of noble behavior. And that's what Seneca means here when he's talking about philosophy. It's not just talking about the academic practice, but the sort of theory and practice that comes into living a proper human life, a happy human life. So here in this passage, that's from Moral Letters 17. He's reminding Lucilius, reminding his readers to pursue philosophy.
Yeah, what a great quote. And there's two other things. I mean, I think you explained it really well. This It's not, pursue wealth unless you have to give up your character. There's an opportunity cost. That's the first thing it makes me think of. There's an opportunity cost. If you think, well, I'm just going to spend my entire life in the pursuit of wealth, and as long as I don't harm anybody or lie, then everything's great. And I think Seneca's calling out, well, you're missing something else you could be doing, which is pursuing wisdom, which is pursuing philosophy. So there's that opportunity cost. The other thing is it kind of contrasts, and I don't know if you feel this way, Caleb, but I feel like there's this representation in contemporary society of philosophy almost as a leisurely activity, of philosophy
Mm-hmm.
as the thing for the rich, basically. Where first you become rich and then you sit around and read books, right? And I remember I used to take this kind of personally. I don't know if you ever had this experience, but I think it's especially a thing in the UK. I tell people I study philosophy and they'd be like, wow, you must be really rich to take such a useless degree. You must be just I guess, a man of means so you can indulge in leisure. And I think Seneca, I mean, take it or leave it coming from Seneca, because he's certainly a rich guy. But I think he's calling out this idea that that's a distorted picture. It's not first you make all your money and then you read some books. It's like it's not the crown jewel at the end of a life, otherwise not focused on philosophy. It is a thing that you can start at any point. It's a thing you can incorporate into your life at any point, and it's the most important thing to do. So why would you delay it until the end?
Yeah, I think that's well put. I've been thinking myself recently that I should spend more time reading for reasons that are somewhat related to this, where it's sort of natural to think, uh, especially when you're a little bit younger, maybe 20s, 30s, focus should be on career, raising a family, whatever, what have you, whatever some of those main priorities are. But there is something to the thought that if you think something's important, say study, practicing philosophy, it's something you should continue be doing uh, all the time. Maybe not spending multiple hours on it a day, but at least the sort of thing where you're setting aside 10 minutes, 20 minutes, what have you, to read quietly, think quietly, um, do that, engage in that sort of reflection, and doing philosophy at that level, at that more contemplative level. So I think that's something that I've been thinking about recently, and probably is really just an application of what you just said. I think that philosophical activities like contemplation, given that they're important, are things we should set aside, but set aside just for later. Assume whether it's wealth, time, what have you. When I have the time, when I have the means, then I'll do it. There's something to the thought that at least building the habit at some level of studying having a philosophical practice is essential.
Yeah. And I think what the Stoics would say too is that you don't, I mean, the contemplative life, you have to carve something out for yourself, right? You've got to find that time to listen to a podcast, to read a book. But the praxis of Stoicism, you don't need to carve out time for that. You're doing that every day you go to work. You're doing that every day you spend time with your family. Every day you make a decision to be disciplined or not. Or
Mhm.
so the theoretical component, yeah, you got to carve time out. And as my life has gotten busier, I read less philosophy for fun than I did in grad school. I mean, granted, that was my job in grad school. I still now, as my work's gotten busier, I try to carve out some time for myself to read fiction, because I think fiction is like kind of very philosophical, because you're engaging these kind of thought experiments, these characters, these morality plays. That's gotten harder. But the actual practice of like, okay, am I going to be a kind person? Am I going to be a just person, a moderate person? You don't need to carve out time for that. You got that in every moment.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Um, so something else the Stoics talk a lot about is different circumstances have a range of benefits and risks, and wealth is no exception to that. general principle. And a lot of times the Stoics are generally, especially, maybe Musonius Rufus or Epictetus, are harsh on the wealthy, and in part because their students often are coming from wealthy backgrounds. And in particular, they're picking out some of these risks that is involved with being well off, being affluence. So the sorts of things they might say is wealth has a risk of complacency. In particular, Musonius Rufus talks about how if you're wealthy, you may become less risk tolerant, and you may be too afraid of essentially of losing what you have, which may cause you to make less sacrifices for others, for your city. Whereas, someone who has nothing to lose, if they're in a different circumstance, they're not going to feel that external pressure. So that's a kind of pressure that doesn't make wealth bad, but it's the kind of thing that makes it is something you should be aware of. Seneca's talking about how you should always ensure that you own your things, not that they own you, and so on. And so that's one kind of risk. And I think the Stoics do a good job, other ancients as well, of course, of cataloging what those risks are. So maybe we can talk some more about those.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think that's absolutely right about you can become risk adverse to a certain extent. My initial thought to that also though is that there's a kind of risk adverseness that comes from having too little things.
Yeah.
There's the golden handcuffs, but there's also the golden handcuffs which is this idea, your job is too good. You're getting paid too well. You've gotten a kind of lifestyle creep, and now you can't take on a different job. You can't take on a different role. You can't change your life because you're kind of trapped in this path. But then there's also, I mean, Epictetus was a slave. Epictetus was giving advice to other slaves. I think of that example about holding the chamber pot. And the slave's like, if I don't hold the chamber pot for the master, he's going to beat me. And there's a certain amount of
Yeah.
risk intolerance that comes from that as well. So I think, but I don't think that I'm disagreeing with Musonius Rufus's point, because Musonius Rufus's point is not, oh, the being poor is a perfect condition for studying philosophy and being rich is bad. I don't think he's making that point. He's saying there's risks that come from being rich. There's probably risks that come from being, too poorly off as well. Uh, so it cuts both ways. But now we're focusing on the wealth associated riches. Another thing that Masonius talks about, maybe you'll pull this up later, but he has that other quote about how a little bit of hardship, can teach you some lessons. A little bit of difficulty can teach you things both about yourself and also about, I would say, the nature of the good, right? Like you realize if you get, here's that quote where he's talking to a young Spartan boy, and he says, pleasure and pain aren't good or bad. And the Spartan boy goes, are you sure that pain isn't good? Like I thought pain was good. And he's like, oh, I disagree with that. But that boy is much more likely to become a Stoic than
Hmm.
the rich
Yeah.
Romans are. Right. So there is that kind of softness or complacency again. But the Stoic answer to this, it's an indifferent. It's all in how you use it. So that's a risk. That risk comes from using your wealth in a certain way. But there's nothing about having money that means you need to be uh, afraid of losing it. Doesn't mean you need to be too used to pleasure. Doesn't mean you need to become complacent. None of those things necessarily come with acquiring wealth. It's just a kind of a risk or a tendency the Stoics are calling out, as you said, because they're hanging out all the time with rich people and rich people's kids, teaching the kids of rich people.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And I think it is a key point that the Stoics recognize that there are risks and benefits of wealth, moderate affluence or poverty, I think. And
Yeah.
whatever station you're at, you're going to be faced with different trials. And it's an interesting question, sort of like, what's the optimal situation? And perhaps, just as the Stoics advise you to surround yourself with good people, perhaps you want to surround yourself in a sort of financial environment, I suppose, that's conducive to cultivating virtue. And I think it's fair to say the Stoics probably would give different answers as to what that would be. for uh,
Yeah.
different individuals. For Seneca, might that number, whatever it is, might be a little bit higher. For Musonius Rufus, Epictetus, probably going to be a little bit lower, right? I think Musonius Rufus and Epictetus are more skeptical of wealth than Seneca is, in a sense.
And so, I mean, this is not necessarily a Stoic idea, but it's kind of a personal idea. And I'm a Stoic, so I guess it kind of counts. But I you're very rarely in any pursuit going to find somebody that's world class at that pursuit and not hyper obsessed and focused on that thing. So you're very rarely going to find somebody who's 220, 5% body fat, just super muscly guy who is not thinking all the time about what they're eating and their exercise schedule and prioritizing that. And I think the same thing is with wealth. And I think so you're talking about that optimal point. It's like you almost pass a certain level where there's a certain amount I think you can acquire while being well balanced. And I think if you pass a certain level, unless you're born into a circumstance, or perhaps, this is not a hard and fast rule. Like sometimes things can happen, and you can start a business and it can go really well, or things can happen. But I think above a certain level, it's very hard to obtain, maintain, and increase without a hyper obsession and focus. And I used to think, even when I was um, younger, I remember, I might have told this anecdote before, but I remember, being at a dinner and sitting across from the richest people I'd ever had dinner with at that point, and all they were talking about was their other rich friend who has, multiple staff at their house and multiple different houses across the country. And I was like, I'm hanging out with the richest people I've ever been with, and they're just talking about other people they know that are richer than them. And it struck me as so surprising because I thought, well, you think after a certain level of wealth, your interest in it or your consideration of it would decrease. And that can be the case. And this is not a hard and fast rule, but often it's the opposite. Often the more you get, it's because you think about it more, and you
Mhm.
focus on it more. And then it creates this kind of feedback loop. And that comes back to Seneca's point about opportunity cost, right? Which is that feedback loop is coming at the expense of something else. It's coming at the expense of your attention going somewhere else, right? Whether that's your family, that's your character, it's your personal development. Um, and so, I mean, because we were using the example of wealth, and I guess this is kind of a separate argument line, which is just that if you become great at anything, it's going to take a lot of your time and attention, and there's a risk of that opportunity cost risk again of it taking it away from, I guess, a pursuit of philosophy or a pursuit of personal holistic development.
Yeah, there's a way in which you can see sort of the optimistic spin of this is that, the pursuit of people who become wealthy, in the best case, their focus is perhaps not on wealth as such, not like I'm just trying to be rich, but often on some kind of craft or building a business or something
Mm-hmm.
like this. And you have that obsessive focus around the craft, the business, and then where you start to see perhaps more pernicious effects of the pursuit of wealth is when it becomes more of a thing that's done for itself. I just want to be
Yeah.
rich. And usually I think that has a kind of social element. And I think that's what your dinner story brings out nicely is I think often when people, even when they're saying they appear to present to have the focus on becoming rich sort of in and of itself, often I think that's driven by a kind of social element, usually is what's behind that abstract desire,
Yeah.
for many people.
I think that's exactly right. And then I think to connect it back to the Stoic idea, why is the person who's obsessed with their craft okay, and the person who's obsessed with becoming rich not okay? Well, I think the difference there is that if you're obsessed with your craft, it comes back to Epictetus' idea of role ethics, right? You've understood yourself as being talented at something, disposed towards something, having an opportunity to be great at something, and you're looking at fulfilling that role, fulfilling that craft. Whereas focusing on wealth is not a role; it is a thing. And so if you put that thing in the top position, it's almost impossible to do that without considering it good, without giving it status above being an indifferent, right? Without putting it in the wrong position. And so if you spend all your life pursuing a thing, you will compromise your character in pursuit of that thing. But if you instead have that kind of that role, that craft, that's I guess that's a different kind of pursuit because it's less externally focused. It's less about focusing your life around an indifferent, which I don't think the Stoics think could be done properly, and it's more around fulfilling your purpose or function as you see it. And obviously, the Stoics are going to say that purpose or function comes after other functions, right? Your role as an artist comes after your role as to be a kind human being, to be a just person, to be a virtuous person. But if you've got all those other boxes checked, well, then pursue art pursue that other role to the most of your abilities. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think that's compelling?
Yeah, I think that's generally compelling. I suppose if you wanted to push back on that, you could say something like, well, part of many people's role is in the modern world is to be economically productive or something like this. That's a little bit reductive, and I think that, there are arguments against what I just said. But if you want to make that a little more plausible, sometimes when people are talking about economic productivity or economic progress, you're just thinking about these really abstract things or material goods. When in reality, what economic progress brings is a lot of what the Stoics would call vicious type stuff, consumerism, satisfaction of whatever people's trivial desires are,
Mm-hmm.
but also just like general capabilities to, say, prevent tragedy or improve the welfare of the polis or what have you. In general, what does wealth mean? It just means having more resources, more capabilities to do both good and bad things, to satisfy both good and bad desires at some level. So all that's to say is, I mean, there is, and so long as you can focus on the good as a person, as a group of people, then playing some role in building, sort of pushing the economic engine forward, as it were, can be important.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, being able to capture some of that value that you're creating is evidence that you are economically productive. And of course, there's lots of asterisks around these cases. It depends on who you are, uh, different roles and such. Some people are going to be good at making money, others aren't. But there's maybe something to that case, and that might be, like the sort of thing that a Stoic capitalist would say is,
Well, I think that's
uh, yeah.
I think that's a compelling counterexample. I guess just to push back on that one last time. Um, I think if you think about why people want wealth, if you asked most people would say either to provide for myself or to provide for my family. And I think that can be reduced. Those can be changed to the role of being a good family member, usually a good
Hmm.
parent, or even a good child, right? You want to take care of your parents as they get older. Like there's lots of, but if you abstract that out to the level of like, I want to be a good parent, I want to be a good child, and have the means to take care of my parents when they get old. I think all of that is fine on the Stoic grounds. It just is not the kind of thing, because it's not the kind of thing where you would harm your parent in pursuit of wealth. It's not the kind of thing where you would alienate your relationship with your children in your pursuit of wealth, because that role is what takes precedent. And then in this case, pursuing wealth is the way to achieve that role. But sometimes taking the lower paying job is going to be the way to be a good parent.
Sure, sure.
And then I think that's the thing. Again, just to come back to that role versus, I guess, ends distinction.
Yeah, yeah. So I suppose it's certainly essential that you fulfill these other roles, and as I think a lot of say the Stoics had a clear hierarchy of roles. So as you don't want to violate the role of being a rational and social human, essentially, and then after that there are things like familial relationships and so on, and then probably after that comes questions about might come some of these more economic type roles. So maybe one way to adjust the argument would be to say this role around economic productivity is something that comes after a lot of these natural and acquired roles most humans have, but it's still an important one. It shouldn't be sacrificed these other rules shouldn't be sacrificed for in pursuit of wealth, clearly, but this later one could be an important one for many people. It's at the end of rule ethics, there's, what do you prefer to do? You sort of get that
Mm-hmm.
open field once you've done everything well. And some people are going to be like, I prefer just to, and I make a lot of money and I think I'm a good fit for that. Others will think, something I think a little bit more concrete. And I think maybe more pro-social, artistic, what have you. And I think that's probably fine.
I mean,
What do you think?
yeah, without sounding, a lot of Stoicism comes back to this. I think if you put money on a pedestal, if you think money is good, by the Stoic definition, you are vicious because you are ignorant. You think the wrong thing leads to a good life. If you pursue wealth for the sake of wealth, you are vicious. If you pursue wealth for the sake of pleasure, you are vicious because you want the wrong thing in life. You misunderstand the purpose of living and what makes a good life. That being said, there's plenty of other good things you can want money for instrumentally. There's plenty of other good things that you can want to do with the money you acquire. And so the having wealth is not amoral. Pursuing wealth is not amoral. And so you can't look at a wealthy person and say there's anything wrong with them. And you can't even necessarily criticize that tendency in yourself if you're the kind of person who's wealthy or wants to become wealthy. It again comes down to that self-knowledge of why you're doing it, what purpose are you trying to fulfill, or what are you trying to get out of, and what would you trade your wealth for? I guess another way of putting it, right? That comes back to that original Epictetus question. If you expect me to sacrifice my own values just to get something that isn't even good, you're crazy. I would never do that.
Yeah.
And how many wealthy people could say that? Not all of them. Maybe less than we would like. And so I think that's that's a Stoic point there. I'm using vicious there, not judgmentally, but in the literal Stoic definition of you're ignorant, right? You want the wrong things.
Yeah, you're a bad person.
Very black and white in Stoic thinking. We're all bad people here.
Yeah. So so that's that. That's some notes on wealth. Let's end with two lines from the ancients on wealth. First, we have from lecture 20, Musonius Rufus. The person who lives luxuriously would also be entirely unjust, inasmuch as he would shrink from performing tasks he ought to undertake on behalf of his own city, if performing them meant abandoning his luxurious lifestyle. So that's a citation for that earlier point about sacrifice. And then a short quip from Seneca: the shortest cut to riches is to despise riches. Moral Letters 62.
Oh,
Go
I was
ahead.
going to ask, is that an equivocation on riches? Like, do you think Seneca's saying the shortest way to a good life is to despise money, or is he making a pragmatic point about acquiring wealth?
I think he's making the first point
Hmm.
where it's similar to the line. I think this was Seneca also quotes this, but I believe this comes from the Epicureans, where if you want to make Pythocles rich, do not add to his store of wealth, but subtract from his desires. I think it's that
Yeah, nice,
exact thought. Yeah, that exact thought.
good.
Yeah, it's good to bring that out. Yeah, it's from letter 62. I have found that he lacks nothing. It is in the power of any man to despise all things, but of no man to possess all things. The shortest cut to riches is to despise riches. Awesome.
Thanks, Gil.
Thanks for listening to Stoa Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.